All right. Thanks for showing up for week 2. I hope week 1 treated you well. As always, if you feel like something's unclear or you have a question or a concern, please interrupt me and I'll try to answer your question as concisely and thoroughly as possible. Those two are sometimes mutually exclusive. So last week we sort of did an introduction to the course. This week I'm going to go into some of the basic concepts of evolutionary theory, and specifically I decided to take a historical perspective to kind of understand the way that evolutionary theory has developed over time. So last time we sort of harped on these two critical questions that we were trying to explain to understand biology. Why are there so many different kinds of organisms? And then how can we explain the similarities among them? And this is this sort of conundrum, right? That organisms are similar, but they're different. And how do we explain both the similarities and the differences? And so like we talked about last week, evolution uses this idea of descent with modification to explain both the similarities among organisms and their differences. So they're similar because they descend from common ancestors, but they're different because they change as they do that. And we talked about the three things that you need for descent with modification. You need some kind of variation, and ultimately that variation comes from mutation, which is random with respect to the outcome of that mutation. You need heredity, so you need some way for offspring to inherit the characteristics of their parents, so offspring are similar to their parents. And then you need some sort of differential reproduction, so not everyone can reproduce infinitely. And so differential reproduction can be driven by selection, this idea that we had of the traits that allow you to survive and reproduce are good, or they can be reproduction can be constrained by drift or random differential reproduction. So that's sort of what we covered last week. This week I'm going to go into the history of thought and experiment and the development of this theory of evolution. And I'm going to take everybody back to the early 1800s. At the time, there were two competing views for trying to explain what people were observing in nature. And it's really easy because they're either that species change over time or that species don't change over time. So the 1800s, these people weren't really complex thinkers, but they had these two competing ideas. Either the species that we saw around us could change or they couldn't. And that was the big debate in evolution at the time. I'm going to put Lamarck up here because he's sort of an important figure associated with this idea that species change over time. So a lot of times we attach historical figures to historical ideas, but just understand that this is one of the prominent thinkers or theorists at the time who were developing these ideas. There were a lot of others, so it's not just one person going out there and developing this idea. But Lamarck did a lot in the early 1800s to both describe this idea of how species might change over time and to argue this theory with other people. And so he had this idea where he used a sort of an analogy of a chain or a ladder to explain this process. And the idea was that species sort of started out as kind of simple, not really functioning very well in their environment, but they were there. And then through some mechanism that they really didn't understand, sometimes they described it as a life force or some sort of driving will that organisms had, that these simple unadapted species could transform themselves into more complex species that were better adapted to their environment. And so that was basically the outline of this idea of species change over time in the early 1800s. And it was it was hierarchical, so the complex adapted species were in some sense better than the simple unadapted ones. And so basically what this theory, early pre-evolutionary theory, boils down to is that one species could, by trying really hard, transform itself into another better species. So obviously there are a lot of problems with this idea as it was put forward. We can think of a few. One of them is obviously that this mechanism is very poorly characterized. Some sort of awesomeness allows you to become better. Not really a good mechanistic explanation, but that's okay. They were just starting, right? This was the initial idea. The second one is this was very anthropocentric. So you definitely think man was up here at the top. And sorry, ladies, it was man at the time. But humans, and at the time, man was up at the top, and other organisms were down here at the bottom. And there was definitely an explicit hierarchy here, which we obviously know now is probably not true. But the big thing that caused a controversy at the time was that no concept of God or any other than natural force was involved here. And that was the big break with what was going on at the time, is that these guys were proposing a theory that species could change over time without any divine intervention whatsoever. And so in contrast to this idea that species could change over time was obviously what was the dominant paradigm in science at the time, was that species were immutable, that they never changed, that the species that we see are the species that have always been there and always will be there, maybe with some extinction or something like that. And there were lots of different clusters of arguments that people used to argue that species couldn't possibly change. One of the popular arguments at the time was just, if you look at the way organisms are put together, their parts are way too complicated and way too tightly integrated to allow one of them to change in isolation from the other parts without completely wrecking the organism. So if you look at organisms, you can't think, well, if a lizard could grow a wing, it could become a bird. Probably if a lizard tried to grow a wing, it would just be a bad lizard and would die. And so that was sort of the argument that species couldn't possibly change. They were too integrated and too complex to change. Another very popular argument at the time was that the argument that there was no evidence that species could change. So if species changed over time, then if we looked in the fossil record, shouldn't we see this gradual progression of species from simple to complex? And we just don't see that. In fact, we can look back to ancient Egypt, which was old at the time, and find mummified cats and mummified people from the time and look at their skeletal structures, and they look exactly like organisms that we see today. So you can't really tell a difference. It doesn't look like things are changing. There's a lack of evidence. And finally, and I tried to wrap my head around this argument and put some sort of rational framework on top of it, but the best that I could come up with is the argument that species can't change because they were designed that way by God. And that's basically, from what I could tell, that was the argument, that species couldn't change, because God made them that way. I'm going to bring up this watchmaker analogy because, one, it's very famous. It's still sort of thrown around. And two, it's actually a form of argument that's used today by critics of evolution. So I'm going to talk about it. It's an argument from analogy, and it kind of goes like this. A species is very complex. If you look at the way organisms are made, they're very complex. There are other things that we know of that are complex, like a pocket watch. If we look at a watch, we can take it apart and we can see, wow, this is really complicated. There's lots of different parts that all work together to make it function. And these complex things like watches, they don't just spontaneously arise. Somebody designs them and makes them. So therefore, because species are complex and watches are complex, watches require a designer. So species must have been designed. And that's basically the watch analogy. Very famous then, still very famous today. And here's just so we can think of what they were envisioning at the time. This was what a watch looked like. And they looked at it and they said, wow, this is really complicated. I mean, there's no way that you would think, boom, watch appeared out of nowhere. There it is. It functions. It works. It had to be designed by something. Cats are also really complicated. They have lots of different interworking parts. So they must have been designed as well. Interestingly, although this argument is very immutable, it still exists today. People are using the same sort of argument to attack evolution today as they were in the 1800s. Back in the 17 and 1800s, this argument was critically evaluated by David Hume, who was a philosopher of the time. He said this: arguments from analogy are okay, but you got to be really careful. Because I can make a similar argument from analogy. Because yeah, okay, cats are kind of like watches, but they're really like lions too, right? I mean, if you think, is this cat more similar to the watch or more similar to the lion, right? I'd say it's much more similar to the lion. So this cat is more likely to have properties of the lion than of the watch. So therefore, cats roar, because lions roar. Cats are like lions. Cats roar. But they obviously don't. So these arguments from analogy, you gotta be really careful, because you're trying to set up similarities and then use certain similarities to infer other similarities. It doesn't always work. Okay, but just to put everything on one slide, there are these old arguments against, this isn't even evolutionary theory, this is sort of what I would call a pre-evolutionary theory, saying that species are immutable because one, they're too integrated and complex to change, two, there's no evidence that they change, and three, they really look like they should have been designed. Nonetheless, the idea was out there that maybe species do change over time. And the important thing about this initial pre-evolutionary idea was that this change is a completely natural process. There's no sort of otherworldly magical thing happening. It can be completely explained by nature, even though the mechanism is a little bit odd. So that sort of boiled around in academic circles for about 50 years, and then we get the full-fledged theory of evolution, which is often called Darwinian evolution, and there's a picture of Darwin at the time. Again, Darwin was definitely not the only person thinking about these ideas. He wasn't the only person working on them. He wasn't the only person arguing for them or anything, but he is one of the eminent figures in the development of this early theory of evolution. And Darwin did a few things that were really important. The first thing is that he directly went at this argument that there's no evidence for variation within and among species. Him and other researchers at the time traveled around the world, often into very remote and dangerous locations, and observed organisms in their natural environment and took meticulous, careful notes about what they were doing, what they looked like. They drew pictures, they took specimens, they gathered evidence, and the evidence came back very conclusively that there was variation among species. And here's a very famous example of the finches that Darwin studied in the Galapagos that have been super well studied since then. And you can see that there are certain groups of finches that kind of look more similar to each other than they do to other groups, etc. We can see a lot of variation. And what Darwin and other researchers at the time did was they took really careful notes about this variation. So they got evidence. The other thing that they came up with was this idea of descent with modification. We talked about that last week. So this is where it came from, the initial studies of evolution. Remember the Lamarckian idea of like this chain of hierarchy where one species changed into another? Darwinian evolution says no. There's no sort of hierarchy of being. There's only similarities and differences. That you can group different organisms based on their similarities, and you can't sort of array them in this sort of linear order. It's more like a network or a tree where similar things group together and things that are more different are farther apart. So there's no sort of special hierarchy with us at the top and other organisms at the bottom. It's just a network-like structure of relatedness. And the third thing that they brought to the table was the idea of natural selection as the mechanism for driving change. And so again, the idea of natural selection is that there's variation in some trait. Some traits are adaptive, that they allow the organism to survive better and reproduce better than other traits. And so, over time, you change the distribution of those traits in the population. So traits that are advantageous tend to spread, and traits that are not advantageous tend to go away. And that this is a natural process. So again, just to put everything on the same frame, what Darwinian evolution really brought to the table is overwhelming evidence that there is variation within and among species. This framework of descent with modification as an idea that we can use to organize variation and understand it, and natural selection as a mechanism that allows species to evolve. And so at the time, the evidence for variation was completely overwhelming. It was pretty universally accepted. This framework of descent with modification was also an easy pill for most scientists at the time to swallow, but natural selection remained controversial. And there were a bunch of alternatives that people brought forward as, alternative explanations for natural selection. One that's often referred to as a neo-Lamarckian type of idea is that acquired characteristics could be inherited. And this is the idea that if, I'm not a very muscular guy, I'm not really strong, but I could get strong, right? I could go to the gym and lift a lot of weights, and over time I would get bigger muscles. And if I did that, and then I had kids, my kids would somehow inherit the bigger muscles that I developed. Now, Darwinian evolution says, no, that doesn't work that way. You can't acquire something during your lifetime and then pass it on to your progeny. But some researchers think that that could happen. Interestingly, epigenetic inheritance does sort of bring this back into view as a potential force that's working in evolution. The second sort of alternative to natural selection, one that's I would say is pretty discredited at this point, is that I don't know what it is, but there's some sort of, again, this sort of force of awesomeness that just allows species to change. And not very scientific. It's hard to understand a mechanism that is just sort of like some sort of force that we don't understand that allows species to change. So that was brought up as another alternative, but it's not really considered anymore. Yeah?
So the acquired characteristics.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So like you said, give the example of the gym. So what if like you went and like worked out and then your son also did and then his son, would there be a time where like after a while, like after like a couple like your great grandkid, would he have like the ability to like gain muscle easier if they all like kind of worked out?
So probably no. And think about it this way: there are two components to having muscles, right? There's a genetic component, and there's a component that you develop by working out, right? So you might have more of a genetic capability of growing muscles than I do. So if we both work out the same amount of time, your muscles are going to be bigger than mine, right? So that genetic propensity you pass on to your offspring, whether or not you work out. So I could have a good genetics to build muscles, but not work out and never build some. My son would get that genetic propensity. Now, if he didn't work out, he wouldn't get muscles. But if he did, he would grow muscles fast, right? So that genetic component is passed on from generation to generation through the genes. The amount of work you do to build your own muscles doesn't get passed on, unless it's somehow epigenetically encoded in the DNA.
But then if you never worked out, would you lose that gene, or would you still keep it? Like if, like, I mean,
You
like further on, like in your lineage, like.
That gene, if you had that gene, it would continue to be passed on indefinitely unless it mutated. So unless there was some mutation that caused the gene to change, it would keep being passed on. So you can have generations of weaklings and all of a sudden somebody who's really strong just because they took up the weights and they happen to have good genetics. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, cool. And finally, there was this idea that there could just be this crazy event that happens, something unusual, a chance event that happens that suddenly creates a change in species. And there is some evidence that this could play a role in some cases. For example, wheat is a really odd event where you have a rare hybridization between two plant species followed by a duplication of the genome, which is kind of odd. And then all of a sudden you have wheat, which allows people to grow food. So there's some evidence that these sort of rare events can happen and can be important for evolutionary processes. The mitochondrion is another one, that a bacteria would be engulfed by another cell and would then create power for the cell to live. So there are these rare events. They're there. So even with these sort of criticisms of natural selection, it was still sort of put forward as a part of Darwinian evolution. You have observations of variation, descent with modification as a way to organize those observations, and then natural selection as at least one of the mechanisms that allows evolution to work. So around the same time, we had Gregor Mendel, who actually is, a one guy who did these experiments. And he was interested in understanding how traits were passed from parent to offspring. So if you have this process of descent with modification, how are those traits passed on? And so he did these experiments in the late 1850s or so. They were kind of lost to science until the 1900s, so they were rediscovered later on. So at the time, the dominant theory of how traits were passed on from parent to offspring was sometimes called a blending hypothesis, that you get offsprings that are a mix between two parents. So you take the characteristics of one parent and the other one, and you sort of average them out, and then you get the offspring. And so this can be understood in this example as, so if you took a pea plant with purple flowers and a pea plant with white flowers and you cross them, you should get an intermediate between the two colors. So you should get something that's kind of pink. So Mendel did this experiment. He crossed purple flowered pea plants with white flowered pea plants. And to his surprise, he didn't get this blending, this pink flower. He got all purple flowers. And he thought that was weird, so then he took these purple flowered plants and he self-pollinated them. So he mated them with themselves. And then all of a sudden he got this segregation of some plants, some offspring that were purple and some that were white. And so the take-home message for what he discovered was that inheritance is not this blending, it's a discrete process. So you get traits that are inherited in a specific pattern, and those patterns can be mathematically described. And different traits can follow different mathematical patterns. And so he really brought two things to evolutionary theory. One is this idea that inheritance is discrete, that you either get a trait from your parent or you don't get a trait from your parent, and that inheritance can be mathematically described. So he was one of the first researchers that really brought quantitative approaches to the study of evolution, that we can have equations that describe how evolution works. That's sort of all I want to cover about Mendel at the time. Jump forward a bit to the next, what I think is sort of the major advance in evolutionary theory. And this occurred between the 1920s and the 1940s. With the advent of population genetics. So population genetics is specifically the study of how frequencies of traits in a population change over time. So taking sort of Mendel's ideas of this discrete inheritance of traits and then looking at it over a whole population of organisms. So a bunch of organisms living together, mating freely in a utopia. So one of the big things that they did was they took the scope of what they were studying and centered it on the population of organisms, not the individual organism. They said, what's going on in the group? And the second thing that they did was they used a heck of a lot of math and statistics. So they built on this idea that if we could discover mathematical equations that describe this process, that was really powerful. And they wanted to use math and statistics to describe how the frequencies of traits can change over time. There's a joke that's often thrown around that it goes like R.A. Fisher developed statistics so that he could study population genetics. And again, R.A. Fisher is one of these pioneers in population genetics. And it's almost true. So if you look at a lot of modern statistics, it goes back to Fisher and trying to understand trait frequencies. So population geneticists proposed 4 primary forces that can change trait frequencies. So the first one is mutation, that a new trait can arise spontaneously or randomly in the population. And now we know that that is ultimately caused by a change in the DNA. At the time, they didn't know much about DNA. They certainly didn't know it was the genetic material. But they proposed that some traits could just spontaneously arise somehow. They didn't really know how. The second one is an interesting one. It's drift, and it goes back to this statistical idea of sampling bias. So say you have a population we have this beetle population. So say we have a beetle population that's half green and half brown. And it's a huge population. There's millions of individuals. And you sampled in a small number of them. The chance that you get exactly 50-50 brown-green beetles in your sample is dependent on how small that sample is. And the smaller the sample is, the more likely your sampling is to be skewed from the 50-50 distribution. You can think of the limiting case if you sample only one beetle. It'll either be 100% brown or 100% green. But that's true of smaller populations as well. And so when populations are small, random changes in allele frequencies can really be important. The third force that can change trait frequencies over time is gene flow. So that's like organisms leaving and taking their genes with them. so you don't have them anymore in your population, or new organisms coming from another area and joining your population. So they bring their genes with them, and they then change the trait frequencies in your population. And the last one is our old favorite, natural selection. Some of the traits are favored in an environment, and so they hang around. Other ones are not. So in addition to defining the 4 primary forces that we think can change trait frequencies, population genetics came up with this idea that if you're looking at these trait frequencies, they change gradually over time. You don't see these huge shifts in trait frequencies. Even under strong selection, you can track trait frequencies from generation to generation over time. And so this idea arose that evolution should be a gradual process that occurs over time and not immediate. And shortly after, this series of experiments that I gave you in the handout, so I'm not going to really go into detail on them, but basically they discovered that DNA was the molecule that allowed for inheritance. So now we had a mechanism, we had a physical molecule that you could almost see, it was really small, that allowed for traits to be transmitted from generation to generation. Around the same time, this is sort of like 1930, 1940s, there was this idea of what's now called the modern synthesis or the modern evolutionary synthesis. And there's this idea that we could use population genetics to somehow unify all of biology. That was sort of the goal. So at the time you had sort of the Mendelian people looking at parent-offspring relationships. You had the population geneticists looking at allele frequencies or trait frequencies over time. You had the naturalists going out into the world and looking at different organisms and writing down their characteristics. You had taxonomists trying to organize species into these hierarchies. You had paleontologists looking at fossils. But none of them were really like trying to coordinate their efforts to try to come up with an explanatory theory, something that could explain both paleontology and Mendelian genetics and population frequencies all at the same time. And so the idea arose that we could use population genetics as a framework to unify all of these different fields. And so could we use it to explain both sort of gradual change in traits by natural selection and this sort of discrete, stepwise inheritance that we see from the Mendelian experiments? And could we use it? Could we use this understanding of small changes in trait frequencies to help explain the big differences between species that we see when we look out in the natural world or when we look in the fossil record? And so some of the main ideas or concepts to come out of the modern evolutionary synthesis is that really understanding biology and unifying all these different things forces you to think in terms of populations. That really it is the population that is in a way the unit of evolution. There is this idea that because of what we understand about population genetics, we have this idea of gradual evolutionary process, that change accumulates over time, and that you need a lot of time to make a big change. There was a little debate, continuing debate on whether natural selection is really important, but the modern evolutionary synthesis really comes down as an adaptationist theory. Natural selection is a driving force in evolution. And really, the main thing to come out of this modern synthesis is that small changes over time accumulate to generate the big differences we see between species. And so at the time, and even now, this is still sort of a working hypothesis, that you have this microevolutionary process described by population genetics. And if you just run it out for a long enough period of time, you get horses and snakes and bacteria and humans and everything. Make sense? So now we have this sort of synthesis where population genetics is really being put at the core of evolutionary theory. Shortly after that, the late 1950s, the structure of DNA is solved, and from that point on, we really have molecules coming to the forefront of evolutionary thought. We focused down into the DNA, and we can find genes, and we can see how genes allow for inheritance. We have this sort of unit of inheritance at the molecular level. Interestingly, though, when we start looking at mutations in DNA, neutral processes start to come up again. So before we had molecules, there was this really idea that natural selection is really important, that adaptation is really important. When we start looking at DNA, we see that a lot of mutations don't seem to do much, that they don't seem to change the organism very much at all. So you change a random base in DNA, the most likely outcome is, who cares? Nothing happened. So molecular evolution sort of brought neutral processes back up to the forefront, although there's still this idea that natural selection, when it is operating, is very powerful. And so that's basically when we think of evolutionary, what a consensus view of evolutionary theory is. It's everything from sort of the pre-1800 or the early 1800s with this idea that species are not immutable through Darwinian evolution, Mendelian genetics, population genetics, the modern evolutionary synthesis, and then molecular biology. And essentially, that's what we have as the body of uncontested evolutionary theory. And there are some more recent developments we'll get to in a few minutes, but that's where we are essentially now. And so what does that allow us to do? I'm going to take a break from talking, and I'm going to show another video about what we can do with a sort of a modern evolutionary approach and how evolutionary biologists think about studying a system that they find in the wild. And you can see how it integrates a lot of these ideas.
The diversity of animals on our planet is breathtaking. Millions of species adapted to all kinds of habitats. Ever since Darwin, understanding how so many species evolved has been a major quest of biology and biologists like Jonathan Losses. In the Caribbean, he's studying a remarkable group of lizards.
She will be back.
He's finding clues to their origins in their bodies, their lifestyles, and in their DNA.
Well, there's one out there.
These lizards are providing fresh insight into both how new species form and why our world is filled with so many creatures.
Don't think I don't see you, lizard.
Here in Puerto Rico, Jonathan is stalking lizards called anoles.
Okay, here we go.
With almost 30 years of practice, he's a pro at catching them.
There we go. He's okay. They've got very strong necks. This actually doesn't hurt them at all. It's a healthy, fine-looking specimen.
Puerto Rico's anoles all feed on similar food, mostly small prey like spiders and crickets. But they divide up their habitats in a clever way. The long-tailed slender species Jonathan caught lives in grasses and bushes and is called a grass bush anole. On the low parts of tree trunks and on the ground, a longer-legged, stockier species forages, called a trunk ground anole. And higher up the tree lives another anole species.
On twigs and small branches like these, we find very small anoles with really short legs.
This slender lizard is called a twig anole. Further up the tree is yet another species.
High up in the canopy, there's a large green lizard with big toe pads. He lives high off the ground. There's one right there.
Like apartment dwellers, each species lives in a different vertical space. But here, each floor offers unique evolutionary opportunities to its inhabitants. The fact that lizards differ in leg length and toe pad size, depending on where they live, suggests that these differences in traits are adaptations to the lizard's habitats.
Here's a good tree over here.
To test whether that is in fact the case, I came here to help Jonathan conduct some experiments.
Yeah, these lizards, they're very cooperative.
We begin by comparing the running ability of two lizards,
Short legs, yeah.
one with long legs, the other with short ones.
Let's do some tests. Let's start with this little lizard here and see how fast it can run up this broad surface.
All right, I'll catch him if he makes it to the end.
All right, here we go. There he comes.
Wow. She's a sprinter.
Exactly. She lives at the bottom of trees, right in the open. She catches prey on the ground, so she has to run down quickly to get them.
The shorter-legged twig lizard is not nearly as fast. It seems like a disadvantage. Why aren't their legs longer?
If you will hold
Jonathan puts a twig lizard on a thin branch to demonstrate.
All right, let's see how he does. Here we go.
Looks pretty comfortable there.
Yep,
Just sort of scurrying along like a balance beam.
this is what they love.
Instead of speed, the twig lizard's legs provide a firm grasp.
All right, now let's try the other one.
So this is the sprinter.
This is a sprinter. Let's see how she fares on this little stick. Look how ungainly she is. Her legs are too long for this. So you can see on these narrow surfaces, long legs are a disadvantage.
On twigs, long legs only increase the chance of falling. So ground lizards have evolved long legs, and twig lizards short ones that enabled their lifestyles. Next, we compare how well two species can climb the slick surfaces of leaves. Anoles have different sized toe pads on their feet. We'll see if these help them navigate different environments.
So it's time for Lizard Olympics Part 2.
All right, I'm game for that.
Here's the ground lizard. Let's see if you can hang on and move up it.
Oh, no.
Couldn't even hang on.
Cannot hang on.
Let's try it again. There he goes. He's getting up there. He's able to move up, but not very easily. All right, let's do another species.
All right.
Take a
Oh,
look
my
at
goodness.
this guy.
That's an anole.
This is the big canopy lizard. Let's see how he does.
Well, it's not a fair contest. He's so huge. There's no way for him to hold up his weight.
What do you think now, smart guy?
Okay, he proved me wrong. Pretty impressive.
He's using the little microscopic hairs on his toe pads to bond with the surface, and that's what holds him up.
And his toe pads are bigger than other lizards?
Yes, they are. He's a bigger lizard, but even for his size, he has particularly large toe pads.
So this is an adaptation.
This is an adaptation because he cannot afford to fall out of the canopy.
But how do these adaptations arise? Jonathan and his colleagues wanted to see if they could observe the lizard's traits evolve by conducting another kind of experiment. Their inspiration was the rapidly changing environment of some of the smallest Caribbean islands. Hurricanes occasionally swamped these tiny islands, scrubbing them free of lizards. The team realized they could use the depleted islands as laboratories. They began their experiment by capturing tree-dwelling anoles on a larger island.
Well, there's one out there.
Yeah.
Good.
Then they visited 7 islands that a hurricane had cleared of lizards. On each, they placed a female and male anole.
Yeah, it's just
These islands have no trees, only small bushes.
In the sun or in the shade?
How would the long-legged lizards fare on thin branches? The next year, the scientists returned.
She will be back.
They found that the mating pairs they had introduced not only survived, but reproduced. And the new population had grown and taken to living on thin branches.
And now she's in my noose.
The scientists collected the lizards.
So the height off, every time we found a lizard, we measured how high it was off the ground, 40 centimeters, the diameter of the surface,
Okay.
and whether it was perched head up, head down, or horizontal.
They brought them back to their field lab, took X-rays to precisely measure the length of their legs, and scanned their toe pads. Then they returned each lizard to the exact spot where they had found it.
Okay, all right. Well,
Now they had baseline data on the new populations. A year later, they came back.
all right, I think he gave us a slip. Okay, excellent.
And discovered that the average lizard leg had shortened in just 2 generations.
We thought maybe this is just a fluke, a statistical accident. In fact, over 4 years, the populations all got shorter and shorter and shorter legs. Evolution can occur very rapidly when natural selection is strong.
Adaptations like these explain how different body types evolve, but they do not explain how new anole species arise. It's changes in other traits that play a key role in speciation. 2 groups of animals are defined as different species when individuals from one group don't mate and reproduce with those from the other. So for a population to become a new species, something has to prevent its members from breeding with members of closely related populations. This is called reproductive isolation. One way a species can split into 2 is for populations to separate geographically. Over many generations, they can undergo enough changes in their respective habitats that if and when they come back together again, they don't mate. So what kind of changes keep anoles from mating? Anoles have a flap of skin under their throats called a dewlap, which males display to attract females. And remarkably, every species in the same area has a different dewlap. So a change in a dewlap is a critical step in the formation of new anole species.
Jonathan, why would these dewlap colors change?
Consider this grass lizard that lives here in the forest where it's relatively dark. And if we look at its dewlap, you can see it's pretty light colored. Now, suppose that a population of these lizards ended up in an area that was much more open and sunnier. In that case, a light-colored dewlap isn't very effective. So over time, the population would evolve by natural selection to have darker dewlaps. And we might end up with this one. And he's got a much darker dewlap, much more visible in a light, open habitat.
If for some reason these two populations come together, the females would no longer recognize the males as members of the same species. They wouldn't mate. They would be reproductively isolated. There's a simple connection between changes within populations, or microevolution, and the formation of new species, or macroevolution. When changes within populations include traits involved in mating, like dewlap color, then the stage is set for the formation of new species. Once new species have formed, competition drives the evolution of different body types. Species living in the same area compete for resources. But if members of one species move into another habitat, they can use resources not available to the other species. Over many generations, natural selection favors traits that enable species to occupy different habitats. This process has led to the body types we see in Puerto Rico. And not just there. On each of the Caribbean's 4 largest islands, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Cuba, and Hispaniola, we find the same distribution of similar-looking lizards. Now you'd think that all the lizards on the different islands would look different, but they don't. Each island has the same basic body types. Each island has slender grass bush anoles with long tails, long-legged trunk ground anoles, short-legged twig anoles, and canopy anoles with large toe pads. How did each island end up with the same body types? Did each body type evolve once and then spread to the other islands? Or did each type evolve independently on each island?
So I'm going to be sequencing some additional markers for this.
To find out, Jonathan and his colleagues sequenced the DNA of anoles from each island. They examined the same stretch of DNA from many species to uncover their evolutionary relationships.
Species that are more closely related, we wouldn't expect to have many differences in their DNA. For example, these two species here, if you go across here, there's only one base pair where they're different. That's because they're very closely related. On the other hand, this species here has many differences, here, 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 and here. That's because this species diverged from the other ones a long time ago.
After determining which two species were most closely related, they joined them together with a node representing a common ancestor. Then they joined these to the next most closely related, until all the lizards were united in a phylogenetic tree. The DNA revealed a pattern consistent with this. Lizards on each island tend to be more closely related to each other than to similar-looking lizards on different islands. That means that generally the same types of lizards evolved independently on each island. On all of the large Caribbean islands, the same traits have evolved again and again. Body color, limb length, toe pad size. Moreover, this repeated filling of habitats on each island by anoles illustrates why our planet has so many species. The simple reason why there are so many species in the world is that there are so many habitats. And each habitat provides numerous ways to survive. In the Serengeti, zebras eat the tallest, coarsest grass. Wildebeest, the medium-height grass. And Thompson's gazelles, the shortest. In the Galapagos, some finches primarily eat seeds on the ground, and others, insects in the trees. Look around you, in your backyard or around the world. There are so many different environments, each full of creatures making a living in a different way.
I apologize for going a little bit over time, but I just wanted to, I thought that that type of study, and that there's an actual study that has been done by multiple researchers over a long period of time, and other similar studies gives you the kind of flavor for the types of analyses that evolutionary biologists do, and really the power of this integrated approach that came out of the modern evolutionary synthesis for looking at these questions by combining things like natural history, observations of nature, experiments, looking at DNA, and using statistics and mathematical models to try to explain both the similarities and differences among species, really using concepts that I don't think anybody really has much of a problem with. There weren't any really big words or bizarre ideas. It's just basic processes played out over time. Again, sorry for going a little bit over time. I'm going to stop now, and we'll pick up again next week. Thanks.